Hello and welcome to the Car Care channel. So should you buy a Toyota Corolla in the 2009 to 2013 generation? In this video we're going to be discussing some of their common problems and things you need to know about them to look for them when you're going to buy one or even if you own one. But before we get started, if you're new to the channel, welcome. Consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some of my other videos if you are a returning subscriber. Well, thank you so much for watching another one of my videos, and without further ado, let's get right into it. Let's start with the engine category. This Corolla had two engine options, the 2ZR-FE and the 2AZ-FE 2.4 liter. Let's start with the 1.8 being the most common. The first problem that these had, and especially in the early years, this is more 2009-2010, they had a problem with the variable valve timing where after you let the car sit for a long time, you start it, you hear a loud rattle, something like this. That is an issue with the intake variable valve timing or VVTI gear. This was a TSB, it was a known problem for these. So when you go test drive one or you're looking to buy one, make sure the car sat overnight, you start it and listen for any abnormal noise. Unlike another engine that is called the 2AR-FE, the 2.5 liter like found in the Camry, that engine did make a little bit of noise and that was normal. This engine should be 100% quiet when you start it. If you hear any rattling noises for a few seconds on a cold start, that is no good. This can get into a little bit of an expensive repair on these, so be careful with that. And then there were a few common oil leaks on this engine. Again, usually the early ones, but we're starting to see more of the newer ones. The front timing cover is notorious to leak on these, but another source of leak is the oil pressure switch, which is also right next to the timing cover, and it could mask itself as a front timing cover. Very simple to check it. Just pull the engine cover, look through the back. It should be dry. If you see a lot of oil, especially by the oil filter area, look up and you will see that the front timing cover is leaking. It is a somewhat of an involved job. It's a high labor job, of course. The repair manual wants you to pull the engine out of the car to do this, but you can actually do this in the car. So if you find a trusted mechanic, you can negotiate a good price to do it. Still a big job. If you have a 2009-2010, it wouldn't be a bad idea to replace the intake VVTI gear while you're doing the front cover, and just as a precaution in case you have the issue with the variable valve timing gear. Another common leak is coolant leaks from the water pump. Now let's clarify that. This engine had two possible water pumps. One of them was only available in 2009 and then it was updated for 2010. Very early 2010 models still had the old school water pump design. And the way you know this is, look at the pulley, the middle of the water pump pulley. If it looks closed up, that is the new style. These are much better and a lot more reliable. They could still leak, but not as much as the old design. The old design had an open pulley. The water pump was much thinner. It just looked flimsy and horrible. And those were notorious to start leaking and then eventually they start making noise and they completely lock up and throw the belt off. So as a precaution, if you have a 2009, 2010 and you have the old style water pump, I would just replace it to the new style, but there's one important thing. The new style pump is thicker than the old style. So when you replace that pump from the old style to the new style, there are 3 bolts that you have to replace for slightly longer bolts. When you take this water pump, there's about 5 bolts that hold it. 2 of them are very long and 3 of them are short. These shorter ones, you need to replace them if you're going from an old style water pump to the new one. Just wanted to clarify this. And something that is very common on this engine, it initially was 2009, 2010, but now we're starting to see it in the newer models too. Ignition coils, they love to go out on this engine, very classic. Sometimes you'll get a misfire, sometimes you can only get a code, and the code is P035 star. So the star is cylinder 1, 2, 3, 4. Very simple. If you see that code, you need an ignition coil. The only thing you need to look at is check the wiring going to the coil for rodent damage, for anything, but most of the time it's just the coil and they can be intermittent. You're not going to get a complete misfire, you'll just get the code. Then the alternators. The alternators were notorious on this model to go out, especially the early ones. And the reason for that is this is one of the first generation Corollas that had the updated, the new style alternator with a clutch. They had some issues with them initially. They can go out. Initially, they were extremely expensive, but prices has come down. And the typical thing for these is they'll start whining, or they'll flat out just stop working and you'll have a battery light on. These are the two things. And the other thing is, while we're talking about water pump, alternator, the belt, the drive belt, these had no automatic tensioner. They were notorious for the belt to be squealing, to make noise, and people will put a new belt and it'll still squeal. The belt needs to be set at a proper tension. And if you put a belt and it makes that quick squeak when you first start the car, tighten the belt a little bit more. This is a manual tensioner where you can actually push the belt. But the one thing I will warn you, and this kind of comes with experience from doing these, if you over tighten the belt, it'll start humming. It'll start making a similar noise to when the alternator hums. So this kind of comes with experience. You can use a tool that checks the tension, but really tighten it. If it doesn't make noise, it's good. If it makes squealing noise when you first start the car, it's too loose. If it makes a humming noise when the car is running, it's too tight. So you gotta find your sweet spot there. Otherwise, mechanically, this engine is solid. And I know this might seem like a big list, but this is pretty much everything that you can possibly see with this engine. But another very important thing, this engine is prone. It doesn't have a problem, but it is prone to oil consumption when they're not maintained. Folks, oil changes on this engine every 5,000 miles are very important. The later models, they went 10,000 miles with a 0-20. You could still use 520 on this engine. You can even use 530 without issues oil-wise, but make sure you change it every 5,000 miles. This engine really gets ugly with oil consumption when you don't take care of it. They're very prone to that. Some engines, even if you neglect them, they're okay, but this one is very prone to oil consumption. So be careful with that maintenance there. And speaking of oil consumption, the other engine, the 2.4 liter in the special sport model, whatever, please avoid that engine altogether. And if you have one, I'm sorry, you're gonna have oil consumption. That engine had a birth defect. It had a problem with the pistons and rings. There was a campaign to fix them, but that campaign is likely expired by this time. It didn't really give the car a lot more power, honestly, and made the car too nose heavy, and it was not worth it. That whole model didn't make sense, and putting a bigger engine made it a lot harder to work on it. This engine is very easy to work on, the 2ZR, but the 2.4 2AZ, terrible for oil consumption, hard to work on, absolutely makes no sense in this car. I'm sorry if you own one, but they're not good. I wouldn't get the 2.4 in this generation Corolla. Now let's talk about the transmissions, and honestly I don't have much to say about the transmission. I don't know anything about them because they are very good, both the automatic and the manual. They're really good on this Corolla model. But there's one thing you need to be aware of, and this is again specific to the 09 year only. There was an issue with the parking pole, and it's not really an issue with the design. The parking pole was kind of not very strong. We're talking back in 2009, 2010. There was a slew of these that broke the parking pole, and the car comes in, drives in, but you put it in park, the car just rolls away. Because, and it was not caused by, you know, an issue with the transmission, people slam it into park. Don't do that with these because they are really prone to breaking their parking pole, and it's a disaster because you basically either have to replace the transmission or take it apart to replace a piece about this big. It just makes no sense. Don't slam it in park. Actually, you shouldn't do that to any car, but especially this generation Corolla because they are prone to that. And I told you that the transmission is very reliable, especially the automatic. But there's one thing that you really need to be aware of about these with maintenance. These say that they have a lifetime fluid. Please don't fall for that. Replace that fluid every 60,000 miles or 60 years, and you really will not have transmission problems. That's just the way it is with these, with the lifetime fluid thing. These don't have a sealed transmission. They have a dipstick. It's super simple. Drain the fluid, fill the same amount, let it warm up, check the transmission fluid with the car idling, and life is good. Let's talk about the chassis category, starting with the front struts. The thing with these Corollas is the front struts are pretty good, but then they get to a point where they just, from day to night, they just start leaking, and now you have noise over bumps, the car kind of jumps up and down. So keep an eye on these front struts. I really haven't seen some leak and then gradually get bad. I just see the car, it's perfectly dry, and then the next time we see it, next oil change, the thing is just completely blown. I don't know what's the deal with the struts. The rears, I don't remember ever replacing a rear strut on a Corolla like this generation, but the fronts, a lot. And every time you replace that strut, because it tends to just blow out like that, you have to replace the mount because the mount gets hammered and gets destroyed, and you won't find that out until you replace the strut, and then you have a noise over bumps from the mount. So always replace them together when you do. One thing on the brakes. So very common concern with these, and this was for some reason more common in the later part of the life of this generation Corolla than the early ones. The concern is you press the brake, it almost like the brake grabs, then the pedal sinks a little bit, then it grabs again. That's very specific. So if you go drive one and you feel it, you just press the brakes, they grab, and then it just like almost you feel like the pedal drops and then it grabs again. People have replaced ABS actuators, did all kinds of things. All it is a rear drum brake adjustment. For some reason, the drum brakes don't auto adjust on these. Even if no matter how long you drive in reverse, they just don't auto adjust, especially in like 2011 and up to 13. If you have that, just go in the back, turn the star wheel, adjust the parking brakes until you got a very slight drag on the wheels, and life is good. This is so common in these that I would actually tell you, if you want your front brakes to last a very long time, because by the way, the front brakes on these don't last very long because of this. But if you go every 10, 15, 20,000 miles, whichever is convenient for you, especially if you're doing it yourself, adjust the rear brakes, you're going to get much better braking. You won't have that sinky pedal, and the front brakes will start lasting a lot longer. And another thing that was very common with the chassis of this car is the CV boots or the axles in the front, especially the outer ones. They love to leak. They just get dry rotten over time, the rubber, and then they split. And now you have grease all over. You want to periodically check these because if you catch it when it just starts, you can actually replace the boots, preserve that axle, and you don't have to replace the whole axle. But if you don't keep an eye on it and your mechanic is careless and doesn't check them, they will leak all the grease and destroy the axle. Now when you make sharp turns, you get that clicking noise, and now the axle is done. You could have saved it, but now it's done. You got to replace the whole thing. So keep an eye on these CV boots, specifically the outer ones, both sides. They're very notorious. This all kind of covers the whole year range. Early ones especially, because they are the oldest ones. And another one that is common, and this is more of a rust belt special, the rear wheel bearings, and specifically the speed sensor and the wire. See, what happens with those is, with all the salt that places like where I live in Chicago, we use this to destroy our cars in the winter. That salt makes its way inside the connector and corrodes the pins that go on the speed sensor and then on the wire. Unfortunately, by the time you clean them, the pins usually break. There's no replacing them. Because this is a rusty car, you can replace just the sensor, but because it's a rusty car, it never comes out and you end up destroying the bearing. So you usually, when you get a rear wheel speed sensor code, you need the wire and the whole bearing. And the bearings are so expensive on these, they're ridiculous. So perhaps it is a good idea to put some dielectric grease on these periodically if you're worried about it. This really affected the early ones more than the newer ones, but the newer ones are also newer, so give it time and it'll get there too. Let's talk about the body category, and starting with the air conditioning system. I cannot tell you how many people in 2009, 2010 came to the dealership with either the AC control knobs pushed into the dash or it's in their hand. They are very flimsy and they are very cheaply made, and that's unfortunately the way it is. Be gentle with them. Don't force them. Don't operate them with force. They're very fragile, unfortunately. That is one thing that most people will not violently control them, but some people did, and especially if you push them hard, they'll just sink into the dash, and that's that. And they can get a little bit expensive, depends which one breaks, but that is something you want to be aware of. The other one is specifically the knob for the fan speed. It was notorious to short out, and then you either have one speed or you have no speeds at all, or it'll be on one speed all the time regardless. You put it on off, it's still running. That was something with the switch. very common. We've seen it a lot. And it also happens from mishandling the switch. But usually, you know, it's a Toyota. It'll take some beating. But this one is a little fragile. Speaking of the AC, I've never seen more Toyota model that is prone to the AC drain clogging than this generation. Countless of them that I've seen that are flooded, completely flooded, total, destroyed, gone, simply because of a tiny little hose that needs cleaning. So if you own one of these, periodically clean the drain to prevent this massive totaling of the car because of a massive flood. They're very prone to this. Keep your cowl clean. I will leave a video in the link in the description of this video for practices that you should practice to prevent your car from getting flooded by the drain, by the sunroof drain if you have one, and by the cowl. Another thing, and the last thing on the AC system, is the compressor. Now, this is a clutchless compressor. It's, for the most part, is good, but every once in a while, the compressor is dead. Unfortunately, these compressors can get expensive. So when you go buy one, don't buy one with the AC doesn't work. Even if you're in the middle of winter, test that AC. You do not want to buy that one that has a bad compressor and now you're stuck with a giant bill because there's no AC. Let's talk about electrical problems. And there's actually a grand total of one electrical problem, but it is so serious in the symptom category and so simple to fix, you gotta know about it, especially if you own one. So you're turning your steering wheel, let's say you're turning it fast, and all of a sudden it starts getting hard and locking up, and the lights dim, and you hit the brakes, the radio shuts off, and there's all kinds of electrical gremlins going on, especially when you have heavy load. The fan is on, the battery lights start flickering sometimes, and it is all caused by one single ground that goes straight from the battery all the way down to the body, and that bolt is notorious to corrode, and then you have poor contact. You basically are losing ground to everything in the car. If you have that issue, you're going to notice that the bolt will strip coming out. You need to make the hole bigger, put a bigger bolt, and dielectric grease, and that solves all the problem. I've seen mechanics replace alternators because of this, steering motors, all kinds of stuff, and miss this very simple thing that causes so much symptoms. So you really need to be aware of it, and if you see it rusty and corroding, take it out and clean it. Be kind of proactive about this. And what is the best year to buy in this generation? Well, that's very simple. 2010 to 2013 if you want to play it safe. If you really want to play it safe, 2011 to 2013. Folks, let me tell you my personal opinion on this generation Corolla. It is not my favorite Corolla in the world. And look, they're good cars. I'm not out there to bash them. But they just did not live up to the generation behind it. It had too many problems when they launched, which you've seen them throughout this video. They got much better later, but it already lost its momentum. And the other thing is, in this segment that it was competing with, you know, the Civic, other models at the time, they were too plasticky feeling, and the way they drove, especially compared to the previous Corolla, we're not talking about other models, it felt too light, too unstable. The steering wheel was really vague compared to the previous generation. It was not the hottest Corolla, and that's why they cut the production early and they moved to the next generation before the full 6 years of production. And the last Corolla that did that was a truly horrible Corolla, the 1998 to 2002. Otherwise, Corollas typically go on a 6-year production. This one went on a 5. However, this is significantly better than the 98 to 2002, which were flat horrible. That's just my opinion, professional opinion. These are good cars, but because they have these issues, some owners will just completely neglect them. You know, you'll have one that is leaking oil everywhere, AC doesn't work, water pump's leaking, alternators on its last leg, the belt squeals, the CV boot's leaking, the front struts, all this stuff piled up, and then you end up buying it and it becomes the worst car you ever bought. But if you, now that you know this stuff from this video, and you go and do your due diligence and inspection, you're going to know exactly what to look for, and you're going to end up buying one that could actually last 200,000–300,000 miles with good maintenance. You know the common problems, you're going to take care of them, and life is great. If you don't mind the slightly plasticky feeling interior, and it's very creaky, it makes noise, it's a loud car, it's not really the most quiet, but the seats are very comfortable, and it's overall reliable with good maintenance, then you're going to actually like this generation. Otherwise, if you want to get into the CVT world, which they are reliable in the following generation, but some people are still nervous about them, go for the next generation. If you want something that felt solid, the previous generation is really good, but they're also starting to get really old. And of course, with age, cars do have problems, even the best ones. I hope this video is helpful and informative. I hope you learned something new. If you like it, consider giving it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some of my other videos. And until the next video, folks, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and you have yourself a wonderful day.